So to start with, there is a very logical reason for doing this, which is the fact that if you take Africa, for example, the average age in the continent is 19 years old, 19. So it's the youngest continent on the planet on average, which means that, and on the top of it, some of the countries like Nigeria, we in the top 5, if not the most populated country, if we follow this trend. So, and if you cross this with climate change, it is very likely that there will be hundreds of million, going somewhere else.
This is Converge,
a podcast from Convera.
Come with us as we shape the future of finance.
Welcome back to Converge. We are at day 2 here at Money 2020 in Amsterdam. I'm sitting down with 2 fine gentlemen this morning, Matteo Rizzi and my friend Micky Tesfaye, who's been on this show multiple times. Good to have you back, and good to have you first time, Matteo. Matteo, can we get a little color about just your background as a fintech expert, an entrepreneur, an author, a founder of TimePledge, which we'll talk about. Give us a little bit of info on who Matteo is.
Great. Good morning, Alex. Good morning, Micky. It's a pleasure to be here. Like kickstarting, I literally just arrived in Money 2020. They call me a veteran in fintech for a reason, I believe. I've been around, for quite a while, and started my career at Swift for 13 years. And within Swift, we created something called InnoTribe that sort of saw the beginning of the whole fintech circus, if you want to a point where,
That's a nice phrase.
Exactly. So it's, to a point where, the startup challenge we launched back then. So TransferWise, the name was still TransferWise. Sure. Back then, there were 2 people. To win the challenge. And then Revolut 2 years later, they were just the founders. And that's how we started seeing the beginning of all this. And then I left in 2013, 10 years ago, a bit more, and became an investor with several funds, helped a couple of banks to create their own venture capital. And then I created my own company in 2015 called the Fintech Stage back then. Today's FTS Group. It has been acquired by Elevandi. Elevandi is a Monetary Authority of Singapore spin-off. But at the same time, I created something called TimePledge, which is an infrastructure to coach African entrepreneurs for free. I got the African continent bug in 2016, and never gave up. And that's it. Then indeed, I wrote a couple of books. I run a podcast called Breaking Banks Europe, which is a pretty cool one. Exactly. I don't know. I lost counts, but maybe 260 something episodes. So keeping busy.
Nice. Micky, we know who you are, but give a little background on you, because obviously this conversation topic is relevant to your background as well.
Yes, of course. First of all, thanks for having me back again, Alex.
Of course.
I love coming on your pod and having a chat with you.
Pleasure.
Micky, content manager for Money 2020 Europe. But as you know, I have a particular interest in Africa because I'm Ethiopian. So I was born in Ethiopia before I grew up in the UK. So that continent as a whole is, of course, my home. So there's a lot of the conversations are very personal to me, and I find it fascinating as a region. And then, of course, I have like my own skin in the game. So that's why I'm like so excited for this conversation with you and Matteo.
Love Ethiopia. I've been there probably 5 times. Super interesting country.
Like our food is great. Our fintech is terrible. So we've got, it's like
for now.
Yeah, for now it is. Yeah,
it is. It's a good one-liner actually.
Well, I have a lot of traveling to do to catch up to you guys. But so let's talk a little bit about. You mentioned your journey from co-founding InnoTribe at Swift to becoming a founder for other companies. Let's talk a little bit about TimePledge. I think it's a really interesting story, and you focus on supporting entrepreneurs in emerging markets like Africa. How does this initiative contribute to, do you have a goal of being of creating more financial inclusion for these markets, and is it aimed at unlocking talent in those areas that lack access to support and capital? What was sort of the driving goal behind the TimePledge?
I have a very cool story behind TimePledge. So what happened is that in 2016, my company, fintech Stage, became a grantee of two major donors, in this space, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Omidyar Network. So Omidyar Network is the fund of the founder of eBay, Pierre Omidyar. And today it's called Flourish Ventures, the arm that invests in Africa. Back then it was just the Omidyar Network as a whole. Mm-hmm. And we started working with African ecosystem. We created a group called the Enablers to actually foster cross payments products, across African regions. Mm-hmm. Because of course payment rails, and we are talking on it has evolved a lot, but in 2016 it was even more like challenging, to perform payments between one country and to another one, also one region to another.
Yeah.
So we were sitting in Zanzibar, in Tanzania.
What a place to be.
Exactly, and especially because we were in Zanzibar, which is a super like a fancy place. We're around the table like this and say, listen, what are we doing here sipping cocktails when there are a bunch of entrepreneurs outside we could talk with, right? And we are here for a conference, so we just had this enablers meeting, spending 2 days inside, but we're staying 2 more days here, right? So why don't we pledge some time to these guys? And I said, we should build TimePledge. And then I clicked TimePledge, .org was available. So I registered there and then. And the day after, we called like a local hub and we said, listen, do you mind? Can we come over and just like share sometimes with your entrepreneurs? Mm-hmm. And we did a session on how to pitch, very simple one. Since then, we talked with over 2,000 entrepreneurs across 8 countries. Wow. And basically the every conference, every event, or sometimes every client sponsored, whatever, a mission or work or workshop is an excuse to then do something with the local ecosystem and open to any entrepreneurs. And the reason why, and that's the start, and tell you how it sort of evolved. Yep. But the reason why I thought it was super necessary to do this is because you cannot imagine how many conversations I had with, African photographers, or like independent people, one people company. They thought they could raise money from VCs, or they thought they could actually apply to like a cohort from a big brand, and it was like a wasted time for them. They were entrepreneurs, but they weren't like a good target for raising money, at least in a traditional way.
The venture backed.
Exactly.
Right?
So even that very basic notion of what does it mean to be an entrepreneur for like a 0 to 1 sort of entrepreneurs in Africa is already a great thing to do to start with. And then it evolved because 6 months ago, I started talking with a bunch of African universities and realized that a few things, but if you take the number of hours that an average African student spends on learning AI, for example, is 3 times less than in Europe. Okay, same time zone, and same thing for like a full stack, like a developer course, for example. So I said, okay, maybe the evolution of TimePledge is now taking care of upskilling African talent. And I founded this African Talent Academy, and I'm currently fundraising. And the idea is that, okay, the world needs 650 million upgraded digital skilled people, by 2030, okay? A subset of them, the top of the pyramid, are actually the guys that, Convera will hire in the next 10 years. The full stack developers, the data scientists, the infrastructure coders, and these guys, you have different ways of forming them, but one of them is actually going to the universities, make a good selection, put them in a parallel course, upgrading course for 6 months, and then connecting them with all the startups that are getting funding from VCs, so that they can hire African talent at the better price than European ones, but most importantly, that can work in the continent. Because
so important.
It's amazing how many startups are actually hiring from Fiverr, and paying them 3 times the price for people who work remotely, right? So
talk about why that's so important for a sec.
I think part of that, why that's so important, I mean, there's a whole host of reasons, right? But I think probably the fundamental one, right, is about growing the local ecosystem. It's what ends up happening is you don't have a consistent foundation that grows, because essentially the best of the best are always going to have to go to a different market to go and ply their trade, because those markets are significantly more attractive for them because they're at the top. But what that means is it doesn't create a cascading effect of, firstly, telling entrepreneurs in the local market that they can stay there, build themselves, and grow. So the kind of most feasible, attractive option is for folks to leave, right? So then you're constantly having to educate, build that workforce that you need. So actually having, even just if you start with one big company, 2 big companies that start as anchors. I mean, I don't have any data, but just even thinking right now of, say, like a Flutterwave in Nigeria, which has become a huge company, just the number of probably developers, builders that were building Flutterwave that have probably left now to start their own businesses in Nigeria is probably a significant number. Now, each is like a multiplying effect, right? So someone from Flutterwave leaves as a has done a great job, does a lot of what we're talking about raising, they know that, and then they're able to build better teams, and then they multiply that. So that's the way I think about it, right?
Absolutely. By the way, it looks like we prepared this, but we haven't, because Flutterwave, it was my first investment in Africa.
Oh, wow.
So I did the seed of Flutterwave in 2016 with the Media Network. And so Flutterwave actually is hiring every year hundreds of developers.
Yeah.
And they cannot find them. Even in Nigeria, which is right, it's in theory and in practice is also one of the biggest cradle, for tech talents.
Yeah.
But they're still short of them. And the reason is that, again, there is a substantial gap in education.
Yeah, and incentives, right?
Exactly, is as simple as that. And today the best developer leaves. As you.
I mean, yesterday I was having a conversation with someone you know very well, and you're doing a podcast with today, Benjamin.
Oh yeah,
and Benji.
Yeah, we had him on the show.
Benji and I were just catching up yesterday, and he was just telling me about, just as friends, we're just catching up. What's the biggest challenge? Hiring, still a big problem. And Benjamin's probably one of the most connected people in Africa at this point. And if he's struggling, imagine how it is for young entrepreneurs that don't have that same access, that same connection. It is very tough, I think.
Sure. So share, before we talk a little bit more broadly about, I guess, the strategic importance of emerging markets, just share like a success story from TimePledge that is particularly noteworthy or inspiring, something that caught your attention and your heart.
So, for example, there is particularly, there is one story that happened last year in Uganda, in Kampala. And it was this entrepreneur who actually, I believe it took him like 10 hours to come over, because he was coming from Eswatini. Eswatini is a country surrounded by South Africa. It's 1.6 million people. And there is still a king in Eswatini. It's a very picturesque as well countries. And I think there is only one fintech startup, which is the startup of this guy. It's called Sandile. And so Sandile came and said, he absolutely wanted to have some quality time. And when he told me he was coming from Eswatini, I said, listen, I didn't even know where, what Eswatini was before. It's called Swaziland And he said, listen, I built a salary advance app because most of Eswatini, like, for example, government employees, it doesn't work to get paid every month. And if you're talking about minimum wage, so a couple of $100 monthly, by the 15th of the month, they don't have money anymore. So what they do is if they don't have any alternative, they go to shark loans. and they also go to shark loans when there is an unexpected disbursement at the given period of time.
Yeah.
And the consequence of that is that it was saying that 30% of the employed population by July, they weren't getting any salary anymore because they were just reimbursing loans contracted at the beginning of the year, for example, to pay school, right? So he built this very simple, like a WhatsApp-based salary app, and I backed it, with some initial money to build the app. And I want to tell the story until the end because he will come back, right? But what happened is that he had a very a personal, complicated situation, which will not disclose for obvious reasons. And then he stopped. And he stopped the startup for a while, and now he's slowly coming back. And the reason why I'm telling the story is, one, because it's very compelling about how a very simple solution like giving $30 loans can change life of people. Amazing. Point number one. Point number two, being an entrepreneur in Africa is not like being an entrepreneur in UK. When your ass is on the, butter and whatever happened, you still have a home and a roof and, some food to buy and some friends to, borrow, right? So, and it's a very lonely journey, and especially in small ecosystems, and you don't have cool working spaces or cohorts to give you 10K, which in Africa you would pay.
Or even the culture for it, right?
Exactly.
I think one of the things that's fascinating to me about Africa, Asia even, is entrepreneurialism is actually the biggest part of the economies in markets where they're emerging markets, where government infrastructure is not as advanced as Europe, the US. Most folks actually work for themselves. Yeah. But that in itself, in a roundabout way, ends up meaning that entrepreneurship and business building doesn't have that same theory and way of thinking that we believe and we kind of accept so much, right? In the US and in Europe, we think about things like, Microsoft, the Apple stories, that's cultural law. And now I think about like a Thiel Foundation, right? It's part of, it's a big choice to go to entrepreneur. A lot of these folks, I think they're not making a choice to become entrepreneurs. That is how you survive. Yeah. And then that jump to actually living like a founder, I think that is such a hard bridge to gap from what I think.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Absolutely. And by the way, big up Sandile, come back. I'll send you this podcast and, I'll make sure you'll be back in business soon.
That's great to hear. Great story. So I guess just thinking about emerging markets and why businesses should really try to tap into the talent there, why they should be focused on growth in those areas, because these the people who are underserved and not being given the opportunities that other parts of the world might have. How can businesses think about that strategically, from what you've learned over the course of your career in many different companies, from as large as Swift to the smaller startups you've touched?
So to start with, there is a very logical reason for doing this, which is the fact that if you take Africa, for example, the average age in the continent is 19 years old, 19. Yeah. So it's the youngest continent on the planet on average, which means that and on the top of it, some of the countries like Nigeria, we in the top 5, if not the most populated country, if we follow this trend. So and if you cross this with climate change, it is very likely that there will be hundreds of million going somewhere else over there. So there's one very logical and almost like a systemic actually reason to do this. The second is how do you think about it strategically? Truth is that there are the private sector in Africa is still, or in emerging markets in general, but Africa is the continent I know best. Yeah, is pretty disconnected from the business today. So in every possible term, like from banks, we're still thinking that they have this too big to fail. 20 or 15 years ago mindset. To the telcos who are still thinking that, let's don't talk about interoperability because, if we have our own garden, is, there is actually in some cases is actually the opposite of what it should happen, because openness, interoperability, open data should be, the way to go. Which is why, if we do a small tech leap, that's why blockchain and CBDCs are actually taking up quite fast in Africa, because decentralize everything in an open infrastructure seems to be like the fastest way to like reach out a maximum number of clients. So the way to think about strategically is to change your mindset, basically. And there are a few startups who are making who are catalyzing this change. I think that the challenge here is another. I have a story. So I'm come from Africa. I was at another event in Marrakesh last week, and I talked with 4 major players, major players of the market. They all run their own cohorts of startups.
Yeah.
And they all have the same problem, which is once the startup leave the cohorts, what do we do with them?
Yeah.
How do we enable them? How do we make sure that they don't just like pocket the money we gave and go to the next cohort, which, cohorts jumping is actually an Olympic sport in emerging markets. Actually, we have to say the truth, right?
Yeah, it's so true.
Yeah. So and we were saying, okay, maybe there is a way to actually contaminate these startups with a true network of global mentors and bringing them, for real to different events where we take their hands and we make them talk with the people who matters, right? Instead of, let's give them a little pod so that we give them like a parking lot. But this is what it happens. They're parked. They're not really enabled.
Yeah.
So how do you think about like startups or changing the mindset? Well, strategically is really like, roll up your sleeves and take these game changers, because some of them are truly amazing entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
They just need the right connection. So that's a good way of putting it.
And I think maybe if on that, I think part of the thing that is really important in my mind to think about, right, is it's a bit like how corporate social responsibility is beginning to evolve. It's actually really all about a business case, because right now around, again, developed economies, what are we seeing? You have a huge challenge in these economies with upskilling workers. That's already a challenge we faced in the UK, in Europe, in the US. Over the past 20, 30 years, we've not really had a great system for upskilling people to be able to keep up with the pace of technological change, right? I think that's why one of the reasons AI feels so existential for many folks. Now, knowing that, we will also have a huge upskilling issue. We also have a huge issue with workers, right? We've got markets, imagine emerging markets that are no longer emerging markets. You've got countries like China or Brazil, which as the economies grow, they're going to be more and more attractive to the folks there. So big developed countries where a lot of big brands are, they're going to have a harder time getting the talent they need. And then on the other side, you've got the biggest, as Matteo said, the biggest resource of human talent in terms of the youngest population in the world is in Africa. And I think the number is something like 500 million or something like that. And we know that, and we've seen in the news, countries like China, Japan, even in the US, we've got an aging population. Africa is the complete opposite. So that is, I think, the business case. But I guess I do have one question for Matteo on your experiences on this, and which is, I guess, what's the thing that has surprised you the most in terms of from that time that you had that conversation in Tanzania to now? What's the thing that you thought, wow, I really didn't see this? You're kind of just realizing now the gap, the kind of, it doesn't even have to be a gap. Is there anything that you've kind of thought interesting? Is now I'm starting to, you know what I mean?
I see exactly what you mean. And I have the perfect story for that.
Nice.
You mentioned
story for everything.
Yeah, you mentioned Brazil. You know that Brazil today is the country number 1 in terms of growing adoption for instant payments.
Yes, I did know
Pix,
that.
right?
Yeah, exactly.
Pix, big player.
So, and this is something that, how old is Pix?
Only a couple of years, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Less than 4 years old.
Yeah.
So in 4 years, one of the most populated country in the world, became now a leader in the world for something that everyone is trying to put in place.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
With an app that probably took 48 hours to develop because it's super simple.
Yeah.
It's an API, everyone agrees. So of course the regulator pushed a lot because it reaches a gazillion benefits for the population at the same time. So this alone, to me is a poster child for how, with the right mindset, and when they're solving a need that everyone has, to me, Pix is to payments what AI is to technology.
Mm-hmm.
When you think of it, so it is something that did not exist in this like a very popular way 3 to 4 years ago, and because it's solving a pain point, in terms of tech, in terms of easy to access, to some intros that before were only accessible to like a geeky or techie people, this Pix gave instant financial inclusion to millions of people, right? So I'm waiting for the same moment in Africa, and in other emerging markets.
I want to quickly understand if blockchain and CBDCs are already making a outsized impact in Africa. What are we talked some about the barriers with Benjamin? I think that he has noticed to broader adoption of those technologies. There's a lot of obviously barriers just across different geographies in Africa that make it hard between the banks. But is that really what it is? That you said it has made leaps in adoption there, but what's the barrier to getting it to be like Pix? My question.
The barrier is the fact that you have different regulation, and you have different currencies, right? So it's true that making CBDCs interoperable between one and the other is not a piece of cake, right? Because you need a lot of alignment, between different regulators. Brazil per se has a critical mass with a single currency already, and that of course and also it started from a green field, right? So, and I think that the danger and the opportunity is that most of central banks in Africa, and with the Levante we're organizing 2 of the largest convening in the continent, and it's all about policy making and how policy making can influence financial inclusion, right? So in both events, we invited a lot of regulators and governors of central banks, and their mind and heart is at the right place, no doubt about it. The alignment is needed between different countries. Is the challenge here. You have 53 countries in Africa, and even if you take the 20% of them that make 80% of the traffic, we're still talking about and there is also a matter of different languages, between francophone and lusophone and anglophone Africa. And of course,
East Africa, you've got it's just
exactly, and everyone is looking at like Egypt, Kenya, Nigeria, Ethiopia, South Africa. Ethiopia is always like the lonely child over there.
It's a weird country there too.
Exactly, you never know how to treat them. Exactly.
We don't know either.
Exactly. So it's that's a challenge, But even naming. The different sort of cluster, it takes already 5 or 6 minutes to explain why you even cluster them, So that's the challenge. It will come eventually. Because, the trade side of the business will have Africa as the epicenter of it. So people will have to deal with it. They will have to deal on how to stabilize, for example, different currency.
And I think that's again the other really important bit, right? I think I'm a big believer that incentive models are a really important part of driving things forward. And I think now as the population of Africa grows and as we get more and more companies and more the middle class starts developing, big global brands will want to be in Africa. Now, let's have an example of a Tesla, right? Let's say you're a Tesla and you want to sell in Africa. You've got South Africa, you've got Nigeria, you've got, say, Egypt. You have to set up payment functions and ability to take money in each of these countries now, which is such a huge expense and cost for them. So I think part of it is just how fragmented Africa is. I think a lot of the times it feels like a one continent, but the number of languages there, where the different economies are on the maturity scale, the development scale is still so far and wide. But saying all of that, I think in my mind, the most important thing is what you mentioned with regards to picks, Matteo, which is, I think, sometimes I do believe that there are way more simpler solutions. And I think sometimes actually that's one of the challenges that holds Africa back. I think holds some of our ecosystem back in terms of trying to achieve the things we want to achieve. Africa is a leader in fintech in ways that people don't acknowledge, which is mobile money emerged out of Africa. M-Pesa set an incredible blueprint for what simple technological, how you can use technology in a very simple way to achieve incredibly outsized impacts. The first time I ever went to Kenya was 2010. I was with my Kenyan friend and he buys flowers and I see nothing, I cannot comprehend any of this, but being able to make that transaction on a not on a smartphone, the old Nokia phones.
Yeah, of course.
Millions and millions of people. So I think that might be
that's fascinating. Really interesting. Okay, great stuff. Thanks so much, Matteo. Just to close things out, I just want to give back to obviously what you're doing. How can businesses or anyone in our audience engage with or support TimePledge and what you're doing? What's the easiest way or the most, something someone could do right after listening to this episode? Are there?
The easy way is reach out to me. I suppose that it wouldn't be complicated. I think that even if you spell Matteo and fintech, that's it. You don't need anything.
The
SEO is SEO.
Exactly. And I swear I never optimized that. Anyway, so just reach out. And the thing is the following, TimePledge is not for profit to start with. So if you guys think that you have a talent to upskill or you need talent or you want to support an organization that will eventually bring talents to you in 6 months' time, reach out and become a sponsor, a donor, or a partner of TimePledge. You're completely open. Very transparent. We'll tell you, where the money goes, which university we're partnering with. There are 6 universities already we partner. It's Maputo, Uganda, Guinea-Conakry, Senegal, Ghana, and Kenya. So, there are 6 universities ready to go, and these students are just needed, the necessary funds to go and upskill themselves. That's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Micky, for adding such nice color to the episode today. And
thank you.
Best of luck, and we'll be following along. Thanks.
Yeah, great. Great to be here, guys.